Maria Callas's Freedomversary Party by J.P. O'Brien. Things on Sycamore Street were, at present, rather celebratory. Rory Caldwell, already surprised and delighted by just how well things were going with his new girlfriend Leona Castellanos, had also now completed 6 months working at the Reptile Amphibian Emporium. The landmark shift was low-key by any standards. Mr. Salazar simply patted the boy on the back and handed him an envelope with a modest stack of money stuffed inside before retreating to the back office. But as Rory's mind swam with all the guitar pedals he was suddenly able to afford, he also found himself breathing a long-overdue sigh of relief. 6 full months had now elapsed since the mishap on his very first day, in which, overwhelmed by a delivery of exotic eggs during Mr. Salazar's lunch break, Rory had been responsible for a stock discrepancy, then lied to cover it up. He had been dreading the repercussions ever since. But as he held the envelope in his hand and listened to Mr. Salazar whistle cheerily behind the office door, Rory at last allowed himself to believe his lie had worked and his job was safe. Surprised and delighted would hardly begin to describe Imelda Ellsworth's feelings upon the mysterious reappearance of a pair of sapphire earrings she believed lost forever. While she was sprucing up the Lenten roses at the end of her garden one afternoon, they somehow showed up in the soil, glinting in the sunlight, soaking wet. She would never be able to explain how they had got there. In fact, the Hershey twins, Daisy and Ruby, having stolen the small jewels several weeks earlier using a hug distraction maneuver that often worked on their mother, had now decided they weren't quite right for their fish tank's sunken treasure after all, and had simply discarded them back over the fence. Perhaps the biggest cause for celebration of all, however, was the upcoming anniversary of freedom and friendship between Marigold Weatherby and Maria Callas. So great was the eccentric old lady's affection for the yellow-feathered canary she had rescued from an antique shop 15 years earlier, an anecdote she never failed to recount whenever the opportunity or audience presented itself. Marigold had thought of little else for several months. Mostly because a party was due. The gentle Norwegian giant Lars Gunderson, during one of his afternoon tea and biscuit get-togethers with the former opera singer several weeks earlier, had lobbied for the party to be space-themed. He was currently 8 hours into, and heavily invested in, a sprawling documentary on the storied history of NASA. This fixation had in turn inspired him to knit 2 new jumpers for Fjord and Snow, his beloved Pomeranians. A white spacesuit with a NASA crest on the sleeve for Fjord, and a multi-tentacled green alien get-up for Snow. "We can dress up," he offered hopefully, in a surprising departure from his usual 7'2" inconspicuousness. But he immediately felt silly. It was nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to show off his handiwork, he knew, and hardly appropriate for such a meaningful occasion in his close friend's life. Luckily for Lars, Marigold positively jumped at the idea. "Blast off!" she shrieked, already imagining Maria Callas sitting in a tiny spaceship fashioned out of plant pots and silver spray paint. The outburst caused Lars to spill his tea and scald his enormous fingers. The afternoon of the party, any resident of Sycamore Street to ring Marigold's doorbell would be greeted by the beaming octogenarian in a flowing hippie mesh dress adorned with suns, moons, and shooting stars, with 2 more ping-pong ball asteroids wobbling on springs 6 inches above her headband. The bird of the hour herself, evidently displaced from her usual perch atop Marigold's wide-brimmed hat by the asteroids, instead sat on her left shoulder in a snug-fitting, sequin-laden cape. Fjord and Snow would, of course, also play a part in the choreographed welcome by yapping around Marigold's feet in response to the sound of the doorbell. Among the first to arrive were Tom and Katherine Evans. Katherine's costume was a figure-hugging black neck-to-ankle dress with a detailed full moon painted over her very heavily pregnant belly. She immediately found her face being pulled down and smothered against Marigold's cheek. "My darling, if you get any more radiant, we'll have to get rid of the real moon and use you instead." Tom, dressed in a full Apollo 11 spacesuit with hair aggressively parted to the side, was wondering where Maria Callas's expensive-looking attire could possibly have come from, and how much effort it must have taken to squeeze her into it, when he noticed the tray of green-filled shot glasses by the door. Finding himself unable to think of a better excuse for a cheeky Saturday afternoon tipple than a batty old lady's bird's birthday or something party, he gave Marigold an affectionate squeeze, then helped himself to one and led his wife through to the living room. They were met with the rumbling fanfare of the 2001 soundtrack, several clusters of black and silver balloons almost totally obscuring the floor, and Adrian Ross standing nervously on his own in the centre of the room. "Just you in this madhouse, then?" Tom winked at the younger man. "So far. Helena can't come till later anyway. She's on a double shift." "Well, don't worry, lad. Reinforcements have arrived." He put his arm around Adrian and necked his shot as Katherine eased herself ungracefully into one of the dining chairs along the wall, showing very little intention to get up from it again. As more partygoers filed in, the drinks flowed and the conversation and laughter grew. A sparkly Violet Castellanos took a seat next to Katherine and was soon tasked with keeping her plate stocked with grapes from the party spread on the table, while Violet's new boyfriend Rob wandered over to catch up with Dom Burns. Dom's youngest son Charlie, meanwhile, dressed as a little Saturn and unable to keep from bumping into things with his rings, had become fascinated by the gradually rotating strands of shiny tinsel dangling from the ceiling, much to the amusement of Violet's teenage daughter Leona. "Hypnotic, aren't they?" she said. Charlie was far too mesmerised to answer. On the other side of the room, an unusually chatty Lars Gunderson in all-black Nordic knitwear, "I'm supposed to be a black hole," was happily explaining everything he knew about NASA to Tony Burgess and Ben Radcliffe. Ben, something of a space aficionado himself, was trying to hide his disappointment that no one had yet asked him about his vintage Cape Canaveral t-shirt, but was nonetheless content to listen to Lars as he helped himself to a plate of rocket-shaped sandwiches. He would afterwards comment to Mr. Burgess that he had never heard so many words come out of the man's mouth in all his life. Shortly after arriving, Imelda Ellsworth found herself in a one-sided conversation of her own with retired educator Clive Rotwood, who kept racing pigeons in a dilapidated loft in his back garden, and evidently didn't think much of Marigold's somewhat more free approach to domestic bird ownership. "It's not natural," he complained of his nativity play co-director's methods. "That bird'll panic at the sound of a plane and smash itself into a door, and that'll be the end of that." Imelda managed to muster a crooked smile at the unsettling thought, but was far too well-mannered to simply ask Mr. Rotwood to hush. So she instead began to stretch and narrow her eyes in an attempt to flag down passers-by. Her unorthodox technique did eventually succeed at ending the conversation, not because someone came over to rescue her, but because Clive Rotwood assumed she had some sort of terrible eye infection she wasn't warning him of, and backed away himself. "Now," Marigold eventually announced, dinging a spoon against her champagne flute and standing up on the piano bench. "I hope you'll all allow me to make a little toast to the reason we are gathered together today, the one and only Maria Callas." There was a polite applause as the canary fluttered in from the other room onto Marigold's shoulder. Tom found himself once more astonished by the complexity of the little sequined cape, which apparently also allowed for unimpeded flight. "What an entrance, my darling! And thanks to all of you for being with us on the 15th anniversary of coming into each other's lives in that dingy antique shop down in Little Berlin. Now, not knowing her actual birthday, I think it's fitting we mark the date of her freedom as just as important as the day she was born. Birds are not meant to be kept in cages." "Hear, hear," agreed Ben Radcliffe with a sarcastic raise of his glass. This drew a scowl from Clive Rotwood. "I just finished a disastrous production of La Bohème," Marigold went on, "in which the tenor couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. What's worse, the director was having an affair with the soprano, and my arias kept getting cut. Favoritism in opera, now that is the real travesty. And then you had the Cardinal himself sat in the box seats, this the same man who just the year before condemned our production of Carmen as immoral. I watched him leer at the cast the whole time with his mistress sat beside him." Marigold's audience stirred as they waited for the story to get back on track. "So there I was, idly wandering the cobblestone streets, and I happened upon this dusty little shop. In the corner sat a wretched, rusty cage. Within it, there she was, my gorgeous Maria Callas." She held the bird proudly aloft on a finger. Back then, she was just as reluctant to sing as I, the poor thing. I immediately felt a kinship. What are we, after all, but souls wandering through the universe on our respective journeys? And yet fate had brought the two of us to the same corner of that universe at the very same time. Well, needless to say, I marched straight over to give that shopkeeper a piece of my mind. I still remember him well. Rather timid fellow, scrawny arms. But no sooner had I bought the blasted cage and freed Maria Callas from its treacherous bars, I was out in the alley, battering it flat with a piece of scrap metal. Oh, you should have seen the shopkeeper's face. At that moment in the story, one of the black balloons decided to pop of its own volition. Several people in the room flinched, while Charlie let out a high-pitched squeal of fear. The Pomeranians began yapping away in hopeless self-defense. Marigold herself, however, didn't even seem to notice. I myself had spent years kowtowing to people who wanted to own beautiful things, she continued. Voices, birds, women, but no longer. Since that day, my dear friend and I have partaken in the same crusade for independence. And I'm glad to say that in our time together, she has regained her marvelous singing voice. So we have a little rendition of a song we have been rehearsing. Marigold, holding her hands operatically by her sternum, took a deep breath and was about to launch into her opening note when there came an ear-piercing exclamation from elsewhere in the room. Everyone turned to see Katherine Evans now clutching her belly and looking around with a combination of guilt and surprise. The floor beneath her chair was damp. She then looked across the room to a stunned Tom, whose own beverage dropped from his hand and immediately made a second stain on the carpet. "Oh, delightful!" cried Marigold. "It appears it's showtime." Katherine grabbed her belly and winced at the pressure, while Violet and Marigold began fussing around her. "I'll get the car," announced Tom, fumbling for a pocket, only to realize he was still in his full spacesuit. "Darling," admonished Marigold, "how many of my green space tonics have you had?" In no time at all, Adrian found himself being volunteered as reluctant chauffeur to the hospital. While Katherine scuttled, crab-like, between Dom Burns and Mr. Burgess to the back seat of Adrian's car, Tom raced to pick up the go-bag sitting just inside their front door. Charlie, in his satin costume, managed to clamber up onto a chair by the window just in time to see the car speed away, swerving through 2 stop signs before disappearing around a corner. Barely 15 minutes later, however, Adrian found himself sitting in the eerie quiet of the triage waiting room, wondering if it would be considered rude if he were to simply leave. Tom and Katherine had already disappeared beyond the swinging double doors, and he suddenly felt rather superfluous. He perched on the edge of one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs. After a moment, he witnessed a young man rush through the entrance while clutching a bloodied T-shirt to his head. The sight of the man instantly turned Adrian's complexion the colour of milk, and he found a plug socket to focus on, remembering how much he detested being in hospitals. Just as he had decided that his job here was indeed done, Tom's smiling face re-emerged from the swinging doors. "Well, nothing for me to do now," he said as he took the seat next to Adrian. He was still wearing his spacesuit. "She's a little dizzy and nauseous, but they got her a bed. They told me they'll call me when I'm needed. Are you okay? You look a little pale." "Yes, all good," Adrian lied. He quickly wobbled to his feet and reached for his car keys, then felt Tom's gentle yet forceful hand direct him back to his chair. "Just take a seat a second," said Tom. He watched Adrian gulp a few laboured breaths. The two of them fell into silence. "This could very well be you in a few years," Tom teased. "Don't know about that," replied Adrian meekly. "Need to get it together to actually propose first." Any bitterness that may have been present in Adrian's tone went unnoticed by Tom. "How's all that going?" "Not good. It fell apart a little when Fjord bit Daisy Hershey on the face." Adrian remembered driving to this hospital in the immediate aftermath of the Pomeranian incident, desperately focusing on the steering wheel while Ruby Hershey knelt forward from the passenger seat and gave a horrendously vivid account of her sister's injury. "Oh, right," Tom said, trying not to laugh. Yeah, I heard about that. Adrian took another deep breath. My idea was to put the ring on one of the dog's collars for Helena to find. She loves dogs. She really wants us to adopt one of our own, but we're not at home enough. We'll talk about it when things change, she says. But I thought if I could at least borrow a dog. Anyway, back to square one. Tom gave a sideways nod. Maybe. An idea like that is nice, sure, but don't get too hung up on the gesture. That isn't everything. It's not about proving how much you know the other person. Not on a superficial level, anyway. Tom peeked out of the corner of his eye and could see Adrian wiping the cold sweat off his brow. Adrian realized he was being watched and sheepishly crossed his arms. You realize you're still wearing a spacesuit, said the younger man. You're just jealous you're not wearing one. I actually feel highly respected. Adrian looked around. A little girl on the other side of the waiting room was pointing and staring at Tom and whispering something into her mother's ear. Why don't you just take it off? I've only got my underpants on underneath. This thing is boiling. Tom opened his legs wide and grinned at his companion. Adrian rolled his eyes and sat back in his chair, smiling to himself. Do you know how I proposed to Katherine? Tom asked a moment later, not leaving a gap for an answer. We were just in the garden centre. It was a Saturday afternoon and we were picking up a bag of soil and some new pots. I saw a pothos vine snaking around a beam overhead and suddenly felt this incredibly strong sensation that our lives were like that, intertwined, but organically. I grabbed her hand tight and told her I wanted to marry her. We were just standing in the queue. That's it? Well, I did it properly as well, Tom laughed. We got dressed up all fancy and went out for a meal. I got her a ring and everything. But obviously by that point, it wasn't a secret anymore. It was now the plan. The part I remember most, though, is taking hold of her hand in the garden centre. That, for me, was the moment. I don't even think she'd mind that I see it that way. Adrian leaned back and stared at the ceiling, the colour returning to his cheeks. A phone rang behind the reception desk. The nurse picked it up and answered in one or two affirmative sentence fragments, then put the handset down again. See, I want to do the fancy meal and everything, Adrian said, wringing his hands. But that's not really easy with Helena. You know how she's got her dietary stuff? Kind of. Well, it's a chronic condition. There aren't that many things that it's safe for her to eat. We've eliminated dairy, wheat, eggs, soy, nuts. But take all of that away and what's even left? Eating's boring for her a lot of the time, not to mention scary. I don't know, the whole thing comes in waves. Sometimes she'll be expanding her diet a little, but then we get another setback. Actually, one of the main reasons I started culinary school in the first place was to learn how to make things that she can enjoy. Really? Pretty much. I mean, I already didn't know what I wanted to do, and I was in a job I despised. But there seemed to be this new path opening up. It just felt like a sign, you know. Tom stuck out his bottom lip and nodded. I've always liked cooking, Adrian went on, and now I get to make 2 meals every night. Good practice. Exactly. But she handles the whole thing with such grace. I don't think I could. Like, sometimes I'll make something garlicky for myself, something she can't have, and instead of being resentful, she'll chase me around the kitchen demanding garlic kisses. She makes it fun somehow. She's taking its power away, Tom concluded. I don't know how she does it. I guess she sees the funny side. A nurse marched into the waiting room and consulted a clipboard by the door. She stopped herself and glanced at the spaceman for a second, then called for a Mr. Pettigrew. A man in a tweed jacket and a flat cap heaved himself up onto his cane on the other side of the room, then trundled through the door behind her. I haven't told anyone this, Adrian said, but in my head I sometimes like to pretend I'm hosting a cooking show, a specialist one for people with EOE like what she has. You may very well have found a gap in the market, Tom grinned. He looked over at Adrian. Would you really do that? Oh no, not at all. Being in front of the cameras is Imelda's thing, but pretending I'm hosting a show makes it feel like I know what I'm doing. It's a little confidence thing. You know, I set out all my ingredients in neat little bowls and make sure my workstation is clear. Oh, yeah, agreed Tom. Gotta keep it tidy for the cameras. Mumbled Adrian. Isn't that the same thing, though? I mean, you're making a game of it anyway. Adrian shrugged. After a moment, Tom got up and gently stretched his spine. He took a few slow paces to the wall, then turned and came back. The little girl watched him the whole way. You know what's funny? Adrian said when he had returned. Is Helena and I met at a dinner party. Tom took a seat again. Really? That is funny. Yeah, mutual acquaintances were trying to get us together. These guys I knew from work who were already in their 30s and doing grown-up things like hosting dinner parties that felt like dating shows. I was only 24. Me and Helena were the youngest around the table by far, and it was obvious we were their little social experiment. But she took it all in her stride. Conversation just falls out of her like it's nothing. I thought she was gorgeous. Anyway, I went a bit overboard with the wine, and I honestly thought I'd put my foot in it. I was blown away when she reached out a few days later and said she wanted to see me again. Sounds like your friends knew what they were doing, Tom smiled. Maybe. I quit not long after that, so I didn't really see them again. Helena told me a lot later that what felt weird for her was the eating with friends part, especially because there was someone new there. She worried I'd think she was a picky eater. I honestly didn't even notice. An ambulance siren gradually grew louder beneath their conversation until it was wailing right outside. A few seconds later, the stillness of the waiting room was shattered as a gurney carrying an unconscious man was pushed through the front door by 2 paramedics. Adrian stared open-mouthed at the man, who was promptly taken through the other double doors and disappeared down the corridor. Once the commotion had passed, a few of the patients in the waiting room exchanged glances, then returned to their phones or magazines. Tom could see Adrian's discomfort rising again. He'll be okay, he said, waving a hand. Best place for him. So when did you decide to go to culinary school? What's that? I just wondered how long after you and Helena got together did you start culinary school? Not long, maybe a month. Why? Tom turned to look at Adrian square on, resting his arm over the back of his seat. I think that's a lot more significant than you're giving it credit for. That's the kind of long-term thought and consideration that makes the relationship work. See, you accepted her as she was and wanted to find a solution. You weren't trying to change her, but you were eager to grow yourself and to help her. That says more than proposing with a dog does. Adrian started to blush. No, I don't think so. The two of them sat in silence for a moment. Tom reclined in his chair and looked ahead. In the corner of the waiting room was a vending machine that was humming to itself, and beside it a money plant with enormous green leaves that fluttered whenever someone walked past. The vending machine clunked into silence. When I met Katherine, he said with his eyes closed, my life had just gone in a new direction. But meeting her helped me see it was the right decision. How did you guys meet? It was at her school. I had been offered a job to redesign their garden space. It was one of my first solo projects. I met with the headmistress at the time and 2 guys from the school board. Katherine came along to that first walk-around too. She's claimed ever since it's because she saw me getting out of my car and simply had to introduce herself. But really, I think she wanted to leave her mark. This garden was being created. She's always adored being outside and especially loves the spring term when it's warm enough to take her kindergartners out there. I'm telling you, she was already picturing teaching her classes on the grass. And you proposed, sort of, in the garden centre. I never knew plant life was so fundamental to your marriage. I guess it's obvious now I think about it. Tom lowered his chin to his chest, failing to conceal a smile. Well, do you know what I used to do before I got into landscape designing? Adrian shook his head. I was a carpenter, said Tom. I've always loved working with my hands, but for the longest time I felt that wasn't quite right. I was a little older than you when I had my big revelation. It was an old friend of my dad's, Harry, who loved his garden and honestly never shut up about it, who taught me the value of adapting, of finding the potential of what's there. You see, in a garden, just because you want to put your favourite flower somewhere, that doesn't mean it's going to grow. The conditions might be totally wrong. So instead, you have to let go of the perfect vision and be prepared to go about it another way. The same nurse from before returned through the double doors and called for a Mr. Dansby. Mr. Dansby duly got up, shoved his phone in his pocket, and followed her silently down the corridor. I started to think about the precision of things. That was what didn't fit. You may have a vision, but so what if you do? There's absolutely no room for surprise, no room for growth. If it doesn't come out like you planned, then something must have gone wrong. But what if you just let things play out for themselves? Adrian watched the young girl skip over from her mother to the vending machine. The money plant's large leaves fluttered as she made her selection. She was soon scurrying back with a chocolate bar in her hands. But what I was saying about Katherine, Tom continued, I met her at the right time. We have a similar mindset. We've always been very much of the opinion that you can't take life too seriously, because no one makes it out alive. Well, she's always been of that mindset, as far as I know. It may have taken me a little longer to get there. But with her, it's an easy ethos to remember, and I swear all of this was going through my head when I was looking at those vines. That sounds like the way it's supposed to be. But then again, Tom hastened, there is no way. I wouldn't try to set my own friends up at a dinner party, but that doesn't mean it doesn't ever work. Obviously it does sometimes, or you wouldn't be here years later trying to work out how to propose. That's true. Put it another way, I just like being with Katherine, most of the time. Admittedly, this pregnancy has gone on too long, and don't get me started on the whole Clementine thing. Adrian raised an eyebrow. I'm joking. Do you like being with Helena? She's my best friend. Then that's it. Maybe you'll come up with some grand proposal that absolutely knocks her off her feet. Maybe you won't. Or maybe you'll just go to her and explain that you couldn't quite think of the right way to do it, but that doesn't mean a thing about how you truly feel for her. Maybe she'll appreciate the vulnerability. That's good advice, Mr. Spaceman. Tom threw him a weary look. Well, maybe you'll be a little more likely to remember this life lesson in the future, smart guy. None of these things matter, so you might as well just go with it. Adrian looked straight ahead for a moment. He eventually turned to Tom and smiled. Thanks. No worries. Anyway, I'm only 39, you know. It wasn't that long ago I was your age, and I still don't have any of the answers. Truth is, we're all just kids faking our way through life. Me, Katherine, even Marigold Weatherby. We just have a few more grey hairs than you, so somehow it looks more legitimate. That's truly terrifying. Oh, you want to talk terrifying? My wife is on the other side of those doors getting ready to give birth to a life that I'm now responsible for forever. On that note, like I said, this could be you in a few years. Tom suddenly jumped to his feet and did a spooky ooh wave in front of Adrian's face. The room full of patients, including the girl now with chocolate streaks around her mouth, froze and stared at them. The younger man burst out laughing. Before long, the nurse with the clipboard returned and called Tom through. Katherine had asked for him. Adrian said his goodbyes, wished Tom good luck, and made his way back to his car. On the walk through the car park, he noticed a message from Helena on his phone. She had finished work and wanted to join him at the party. He got behind the wheel and composed a message explaining what had happened. But anyway, he wrote, I'll see you back there. Can't wait. X. Once he arrived at Marigold Weatherby's house, he was disappointed to find that Maria Callas's party was winding down and most of the revellers had already left. Lars, Violet, and a euphoric and ever so slightly tipsy Marigold were moving rubbish into black bags, while Imelda could be heard pleasantly chirping away and washing up in the kitchen. Fjord and Snow were asleep in a bundle under the table. Adrian, how's Katherine? Asked Violet. Oh, she's fine, I think. There's not a lot going on just yet, mostly waiting. He rolled his sleeves up and started gathering the remaining decorations. The balloons made sad, squeaking sounds as Lars deflated them. When Helena arrived, she was munching on carrot sticks from a Ziploc bag. Adrian came over, wrapped his arms around her, and squeezed her. "Hi," she said, mouth full and a little surprised. "Hi." That evening, as the two of them were cuddling up on the sofa watching TV, Adrian's phone buzzed with a message from Tom. "Wanted you to be one of the first to see him. This is James." Then popped up a photo of the newborn in the arms of an exhausted but elated Katherine. Another message bubble appeared. "One day he might come to you in need of advice. You might not know what to say, but you'll help as best you can. The words will just come. T." You have been listening to the By Torchlight podcast. For more, visit patreon.com/bytorchlight or search By Torchlight on Spotify and YouTube.